Dear Dr. Northrup, thank you so much for the shout out on your Great Awakening video series where you mentioned Conspirituality podcast on October 17. You said some hopeful things, but also some confusing things. And I wanted to take a moment here just to ask you some questions, if you're open, and to invite some actions on your part, if this resonates for you, if this makes sense to you. So it was troubling on October 7th to notice that you referenced, albeit incompletely, a gun control case in the Supreme Court from the 90s, in which Justice Antonin Scalia opined that it was unconstitutional to require sheriffs to perform background checks at gun shows. Now, you didn't mention the case was really about that. You talked more about freedom and the pursuit of happiness. Was that a deliberate omission?
Sheriff Richard Mack and Sheriff Prince of Arizona successfully took a case all the way to the Supreme Court when it was government overreach against individual life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And Justice Scalia wrote the decision, and he said government overreach, which is very relevant now. The Constitution protects us from our best intentions. It protects us from well-meaning governors who are issuing mandates for our safety and protection. It protects us from wayward, that would be unconstitutional, governors or mayors, and it protects us from tyrants.
The case, for anyone who's not sure, is Prince, P-R-I-N-Z, versus United States. It's from 1997. And it had to do with Bill Clinton's Brady Bill, which was, I believe, an amendment to the gun control laws of 1968. And this required that at gun shows, if you were going to sell a gun to someone, you had to do a background check. And there was technology put in place to make that possible as part of the sales process. And it required that local law enforcement made sure that this was happening so that people at gun shows who had criminal histories and were prohibited by law from buying guns were unable to do so. Did you know that? Now next, as a feminist health advocate, how do you square quoting Antonin Scalia on, of all things, gun control, given his history of rejecting again and again in case after case women's constitutional rights and equality on everything from education to citizenship of children to reproductive freedoms?
Did you know that our sheriffs, these are the duties of sheriffs, right? They work for the people. They are elected. They do not work for politicians. They work for us, the people. And they do not answer to anyone else. And the only boss the sheriff has are the people. So I want you to find out who your sheriff is in your county. All of them take an oath to protect the 6th article of the Constitution. It's recited at every officer's swearing in, to protect individual liberty and God-given rights.
Have you done your research on the 1878 Posse Comitatus Act? This is the law that you're referencing that enables sheriffs to deputize civilians in order to keep the peace. But really, what it does, especially nowadays and back then too, is it inspires ultra-conservative militias, the ones that have been arming up and preparing for civil war in the woods for decades. Posse Comitatus was also the actual name taken by a militia started in the 70s with neo-Nazi roots that ended up seeding the militias that rose up in the 90s and became much more prominent, much more awareness of them in the culture, that led to events like the Oklahoma City bombing, the worst case of domestic terrorism in America's history, the disastrous events in Waco, Texas. The oath you're referencing also happens to be very similar, if not identical, with the oath that Mike Flynn and his family recited in a Twitter post on July 4th of this year, and then ended that recitation by saying, "Where we go one, we go all." Mike Flynn, who included QAnon hashtags in that particular tweet and has QAnon hashtags in his bio on Twitter and is seen by many of the Q faithful as being a key member, sometimes even imagining that he is Q himself, a key part of that whole mythology. All this talk about patriotism and sheriffs and gun rights and militias, it clusters around far-right preparations for a coming civil war against perceived tyrannical government. This has ancient roots in our history, but it is alive right now in ways that it hasn't been for a really long time. And I want to suggest that whether you know it or not, you may be perceived as dog-whistling domestic terrorism and violent conservative and even white supremacist insurrection. Dr. Northrup, I don't know if you're friends or if you consider yourself colleagues with the Line in the Sand conference organizers and hosts, but on that 4-hour live-streamed event on October 2nd, they went one step further than kind of dog whistling or flirting with some of the stuff that I'm bringing to your attention. They amplified mythic imagery around a kind of spiritual warfare while also calling for active confrontation of public health officials, of law enforcement, of anyone who might be seen as promoting what was described as a demonic agenda, a leviathan, a Medusa that had to be eviscerated and taken out altogether.
And Kevin, rather than push back against legislature and legislators, why not get rid of them altogether? I mean, for the love of God, when we're dealing with treason, it doesn't get more serious than that. When we deal with agendas which are leading to anything but, genocide by any other name, surely it's about evisceration. It's about eradication. It's about wholesale takedown of the godless, goddamn toxin in our civilizational midst. We should not be couching or negotiating with any ambiguity with this godless creature. This is a leviathan. This is a Medusa. And we need to take it out altogether.
Kevin Jenkins, another guest on Line in the Sand, talked about confronting people where they live and letting them know that they will not survive unless they allow us to have our freedoms.
Don't let them be comfortable. Go where they live, go where they eat, go where everywhere they go. They should not feel comfortable. We should fight them everywhere they live. If they go to the bathroom, we should be there. If they go to get a cup of coffee, they should be there. Elected officials believe they can get away with anything because they believe we will intellectualize our narrative as opposed to challenging them in a very interesting way. Let's put it that way. And they're taking advantage of that. I think it's time to stop being politically correct. I think it's time to start looking them in the face and say, if I can't live my humanity, you won't survive.
Very good.
Beautiful.
Very good. Well, the mask is the beginning of deleting individuality, and he who does not know his history is condemned to repeat it. You're unable to say certain things, or perhaps, I will step in and say what doesn't need to be tempered. We are being cult programmed. I mean, you talk about removing the relationship between a newborn babe and its mother. This is satanic cult programming. Let's call it what it is. This is satanic. This is the cult of Baphomet. This is Molokite worshipping stuff. It gets very gory in the basement. There are many specialists in the world that we've dealt with the International Tribunal who testify to that. And there's many, many millions of souls who have been butchered at the hands of the perpetrators of satanic ritualism, ritual sacrifice, ritual satanic abuse, and plain household Luciferianism.
Do you really think that's true? Is that what's going on here? Do you endorse their statements inciting violence in the name of spiritual warfare, or are you willing to distance yourself and condemn those statements publicly?
On April 4th, 2020, I began a daily talk on Facebook and Instagram called The Great Awakening. I was referring to the ancient prophecies and the astrology of this time. About that same time, not sure when, I also did a Zoom interview with Sean Morgan, a young father who had questions on vaccines. I had no idea whatsoever that he was closely connected with the Q movement. I just learned that this week, that's true. Turns out my interview with him was the only one that YouTube removed. Nor did I know that the term Great Awakening was also associated with that movement. It's widely used in other contexts.
Dr. Northrup, I'm willing to believe that you did not know that calling your video series that started around the same time as pandemic and all of this QAnon conspiracy stuff sort of coming up in the cultural collective consciousness, I'm willing to believe that you did not know that calling your video series The Great Awakening had so much overlap with QAnon mythology. But now that you do know, are you willing to publicly disavow the way that they use the term and be clear about what's different regarding what you're talking about? I'm also willing to believe that you did not know about Sean Morgan's affinities, as you say, when you interviewed him. His Twitter handle and his podcast both go by the same name, QAnon FAQ. Now, that may have happened after you interviewed him. I'm not entirely sure of the timeline there. I do notice, though, that one of his podcast episodes is called How to Red Pill Normies. And I wonder if you did not know, or if he kept it hidden from you, where he was coming from with regard to these sorts of conspiracy theories, if maybe he played a role in starting to red pill you without you really knowing it.
Then a well-respected yoga teacher who is in my community told me that 3 well-known yoga teachers, whose names I don't remember, launched a podcast called Conspirituality. And I was targeted for, quote, using terms associated with Q. My colleague Kelly Brogan, MD, was also labeled. We both made it to a graph called Conspirituality on the Q slope. Whatever that is, we laugh that we are suddenly conspirators in something we know little about. But if you have to be falsely labeled, it's nice to have good company.
I know nothing about QAnon.
I just told you.
I know very little. You told me, but I know nothing about it. I do know they are very much against pedophilia.
The real conspiracy has nothing to do with whatever Q is. It is the blatant and egregious censorship in the mainstream media of anything that goes against the mainstream narrative of we need to be afraid of each other, something deadly is out there to kill us if we don't mask up, and we can't come out until everyone has been vaccinated.
I can't help but wonder if this is a case of passionate convictions about vaccines being dangerous and other alternative health, sincerely held positions gradually snowballing and picking up pace over time into aligning yourself with ideas, beliefs, individuals, and groups that now have your house snowed in, so to speak. Though the invitation may not be immediately welcome, we are willing to support you in digging your way out. Our door is open and our shovels are ready. Dear Dr. Northrup, if you're listening, thank you for your time.